Hey everyone, so excited you could join us today. We are talking about how worship leaders connect and communicate with piano and keys players. And I have one of my great friends here, Travis Thompson, and he's played keys several times here at Kingsland, but he is the worship director at Sojourn Montrose in downtown Houston. Travis, tell us a little bit about how long you've been playing, where you got started, and if you've had any training.
Sure. So I started playing keys and piano in second grade. My mom signed me up for classical lessons against my will and said, you have no choice. You're going to be a piano player and until you like it. And so I took classical lessons up until 10th grade. And at that point, my mom gave me an out if I wanted it and said, all right, if you don't like it anymore, you can finally quit now. But at that point, I liked it. I started taking jazz band in high school to get my arts credit and wound up just falling in love with the world of jazz and chording and improvisation and stuff like that. And beyond that, that was right when I started getting involved in my high school worship band. And then I went to college, not for music, but stayed playing music and worship all throughout college and never looked back.
That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
And Travis is an incredibly gifted musician. You've heard us say that in multiple videos, but this guy has a wide range of what he can do on the keys and the piano, and he also has a little music. Tell us about Iron Kids, right?
Yeah, so I produce as well, both for other artists and clients and for myself, and I have my own project called Iron Kids that is just pure unadulterated EDM, if you're into that kind of thing. Saying it sounds so stereotypical, but dubstep, future bass, house music, stuff like that.
Yes.
Really great worship material, actually. Yeah.
It's fun to go listen to. He's got some great videos out on YouTube that you can check out. But Travis, we're excited to have you and excited to dive in what piano and keys and how we can communicate well as worship leaders to you guys. So one of the first things we want to start with is distinguishing the difference between playing piano on a song and playing keys on a song in a band. And Travis, give us a little bit of maybe an example when you were just focusing on the piano parts, maybe the themes or the licks. You know, what would you do versus maybe more of the foundational setting of keys?
Right. So I think when we talk about playing piano, what we are talking about is sticking with just a piano sound as opposed to keys when the options of sounds you might play at any moment open up pretty wide. You're also, as a piano player, probably going to be a little busier playing more melodic themes, lower on the left hand, maybe even higher on the right hand, and which is great if that's what the song calls for. When we talk about playing keys, I think we are talking about being less busy. It's about understanding your space within a band. If you think of a band like a house, you have a room that you can occupy, and it's generally not going to be very helpful if you start barging into other people's rooms within that house and claiming them as your own. And that means not playing licks on top of a guitar lick. It could mean not playing low notes and fighting with the bass for that low register. It means not fighting with vocalists in terms of where you play on the keyboard or how busy you are while someone's singing. And so I like to think of keys as just a simplified version of playing piano as far as the notes you're playing. However, it opens up a whole new world of sound options, and which we can get to in a little bit. So I'm going to play In Christ Alone as a piano player and then as a keys player. So here's a piano player. I'm probably going to be playing some melodies. I'm going to be doing some runs, and it's going to sound a little like this. Pretty busy. The amp is really special. And so that was kind of the more piano philosophy, right? Now let's think about how do we fit into a band where other instruments have responsibilities that you might want to claim for yourself. And this is something personally that took me a long time to process and understand because I was trained first and foremost as a classical pianist, and classical piano is just all over the place. And so let's cut it back. Let's think about a band. You might have a click track in your head, you might not. Either way, there's going to be a drummer carrying a beat, and think about the singer. So we'll say, in Christ. So what you can see there is I'm way less busy. I'm keeping my hands more structured, playing chords. I'm not reaching nearly as low in the left hand as I might be in a quote-unquote piano setting. Yeah. And that's not to say that you can absolutely never lick or do any kind of flair in your playing. There's definitely going to be room for you to do some of that stuff, but over time you develop a sense of when it is and isn't appropriate.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what are you technically doing. In your left hand, it looks like you're doing fifths, right?
Generally, yes.
Okay, and then the right hand, you're keeping it pretty close in the fifth range.
Right.
But tell me, as you're transitioning the chords, are you in different inversions? I know as piano players, we know what inversions are.
This is one of those things that's really subjective, especially in the right hand. I think the left hand is a little more objective on what sounds good.
Yeah.
Generally, my philosophy is I'm usually, whatever the lowest note is that I'm playing is the root of the chord. So in Christ Alone, it goes A to E, and then C sharp minor to B, so I'm going. And then there's also passing 3 in a lot of those, so I'm hitting that 3 in the left hand as well. On the here in the power of Christ I stand. And then in the right hand, with this song, it's just, I've played it so many times, I've kind of autopilot to the inversions that I choose. But again, there's no objectively right way to invert chords. I think generally the less you're moving your hand physically around the keyboard to reach the chords you want, the smoother and more fluid you're going to sound. So this is a very exaggerated idea, but if you're playing the most basic inversions of In Christ Alone, it'll sound like. And it sounds very disjointed. The other point I was making too is just the way your chords flow from one to another, and regardless of how busy you might be playing, generally it's better to play inversions such that your hand doesn't have to move very much, right? So if you're playing a 6-4-1-5 progression, instead of playing it, you saw my hand go back and forth, you can do my hand didn't go anywhere, and that flowed a little better. Does that make sense?
That's good. So great things to think about, because most of you guys maybe have some piano training, I'm assuming, but are playing keys, or maybe you just started playing keys. And so there's little transitions that you have to make depending on what your background is, where you come from. But the keys player can have a very simple role, and then as you develop those foundational skills, like the inversions that keep your hand in a similar place on the keyboard, then you're able to add some ornamentation as you practice some of those transitional moments. So now let's take a moment and talk about the role of a keys player inside the band as far as maybe an expectation that a worship leader would have. A lot of times I'm wanting the keys player to be the glue between the songs. From the beginning of the service, before we start the first song, and between each moment in the service. And so one of the ways to do that is by practicing transitions between keys. And so if you're just on a keys, and let's say we're in the song in the key of C, how would we get smoothly from the key of C to the key of D between songs?
First, what is the interval between the keys you're jumping between? So in this case, we're going from C to D, so that's just a whole step interval, which is, it's not the worst, but it's also not the best jump. The second thing to consider is the behavior of your pad sound. It's very important that your pad has very long what's called attack and release. An attack is how long the sound takes to get to its max volume. So I'll play this note, and you'll hear that pad slowly fade in underneath, and then I'll let go, and the pad has a nice slow decay or release. Yeah. The smoothness of that volume is really important to minimize distractions during transitions and key changes. The second thing you want to consider is the interval. And if your interval is a perfect fourth or a perfect fifth, it's a pretty smooth transition no matter what. When it's not one of those two, you can start thinking about, well, what chords do these keys have in common with each other? So when we're in the key of C, they share, the key of C major and the key of D major share a G major as a common chord. So what you can do is play some kind of chord progression in C and then get to that G major chord and just let it hang there for a minute. And that way it'll give the congregation a chance to kind of get the idea of C major out of their head. And then when you're ready, drop down to that D, and it's a nice, melodically smooth. If you have a really bad key change you got to take care of, like a tritone, let's say you want to go from C to F sharp, which is real ugly, or you want to go from C to B, also very ugly. There are ways to learn and understand passing chords and transitioning smoothly into those keys. I find it better in contemporary worship where you're not playing really exotic chords to just let it breathe for a second. Allow for 1 second of silence. That's not going to be too distracting to anybody. So you play that last C chord, let it hang for just a second, let the pad fade, and then you can transition back into F sharp.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So getting an opportunity to just have a little breath. So that's one way, and it's not bad to have a stop because you could tell the decay of the pad really allowed it to have a closure and then reopening a new moment. And there are many times you don't always have to play a transitional chord. You can do just that, even if it's from the key of C to the key of D. But that's a great example of how we can transition and keep the flow of the service going, because that's super important with this instrument. Another way the keys player is used in a band is to play through some of those invitation moments, or maybe you have a soft prayer moment inside of your worship set. Travis, how would you approach what you would do on keys during a prayer moment or an invitation?
The goal of these moments is to not be distracting, number one, and just create an atmosphere of comfort and invitation, and one where people will feel open to praying or participating in whatever spiritual event is happening. And so the idea of warmth is very important here. Pads are a very warm instrument. Warmth implies the range of the frequency spectrum they occupy. As far as the piano parts go, my personal taste is I love playing Rhodes. Almost every keyboard has some kind of Rhodes sound on it. So no matter if you have a cheap keyboard or a nice one, you're going to have a Rhodes on it. And my philosophy is I use drone pads, but I also have a pad on this that I'll use just for demonstration. But let's say we're coming out of a song that's in the key of D. Since we transitioned into D, let's stay there. I will pick a chord progression that's very simple and non-distracting and play a Rhodes. And just, let's say we're doing a 4, 6, 1, 5. So we'll just sound and keep it really slow and simple. And you don't have to stick to any sort of internal tempo. You can keep it nice and open.
I found it very helpful in these times to not really play even a recognizable melody, because at that moment, if you have musicians in the congregation or in the setting, that can take them to a place, and maybe the Lord wants to speak to them in that moment. So I'll just say, be very open, be very simple, like you're being, and just give it space. I love that.
Yeah.
Good listen to that all day. That's good stuff, man. Okay, so let's take a basic worship song like Lion and the Lamb, and what I want to do is from intro to verse 1 to the chorus, let's give them some ideas of what they could do on the keys part to add energy, and where they could stay out of the way of vocals, and where they could add some subtle just flavor to what's going on. So let's do Lion and the Lamb. Let's do the key of G.
Okay.
And let's try it here on the intro and see what happens.
1, 2, 3, 4.
On the intro, you lightly played the theme a little bit, because we know a lot of that's electric guitar,
right?
But you were complementing that. When we got to the verse, you simplified, and then you added a little bit more energy on the chorus. Tell me just a little bit. We kind of got the intro down, just sort of lightly playing that melody. But what did you do on the verse that was different?
Yeah, I do want to say one quick thing on the intro, which is that is specifically to Lion and the Lamb and a lot of songs. That was an electric guitar intro, and I think actually a lot of the times, unless you have another job, doubling the electric guitar can sound cool. It keeps the electric guitar in front because that's the more cutting sound, but you can absolutely add some depth and kind of meat to that lick by doubling it.
Agreed.
Okay, so the verse, generally, if you're thinking about the song, obviously the most important thing is to understand the key and the scale that you're working in. So in this case, we're in G major, and our first chord is a G, the 1. And so understanding what notes sound good where is just something that you will develop over time. But I was keeping it simple because the verse of Lion and the Lamb is all about a drum groove, and it's all about vocals and a bass. Those are kind of the things that are carrying. So as piano in that song, our job is to provide what I like to call ear candy, which is stuff that you might not hear and go, oh, I heard that great piano lick, but it's still adding to the song and creating depth and space. So I kept it pretty open. I took the liberty of playing some sevens there. I played a minor 7 on the 2, and then when I went to the 4, I used a little grace note to kind of walk up into that 3rd, which tastefully placed grace notes are always nice, I think. Not too many of them. And so those are just very little things that are fitting into a more open sound, playing quarter notes.
When you're saying open sound, just to confirm, tell me what your right hand's doing right there. Are you fourths? What is that?
On the 1, I'm playing the root on top and the 5th down low. Okay, so it looks like a 4th effectively. But my personal philosophy, I don't know why, but when I'm playing the 1 chord, I usually actually don't throw the 3 in because it sounds cheesy to me. But I'll throw the 3 into other chords. It's just the 1 chord. I don't like the 3rd.
That's okay.
And then this is a inversion of the 2 chord. That is very close, geographically speaking, to the 1. And the inversion works by playing your root, the A, in the left hand, and then actually a C major chord in the right hand. That's what makes it a minor 7. And then walking down to that 4, just like that.
Tasteful little
a little grace note. And then played another minor 7 on the 6th chord. And kept this kind of groove going. Broken hearts declare his praise. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? lullaby, and right there it's going into that lift on the who can stop, you can let it hang a little bit to create some anticipation into the chorus.
And then in the chorus, what did you transfer to now?
And then in the chorus, I got a little busier, not too much. So just a little more rhythmic, eighth note kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then on the tag, the big line of the song is "Who can stop the Lord Almighty?" So I like accenting that line by playing the melody along with the singer. So going like, "Who can stop the Lord Almighty?"
Yeah. So I think that's a cool distinction that I hear in keys players all the time. Is they are listening very well to the surroundings of the band. If there's a guitar lick that it's mostly them, Travis mentioned earlier, he's playing that lick underneath and giving a little bit of strength and foundation to that. And then sometimes he's listening to the vocal and, not all the time doubling the vocal. That's kind of a classical move at times, but sometimes doubling the vocal line, and it just gives a little bit of flavor. So there is the accents and the cracks of music, that we'll talk about here in just a second, but then there's also these ones that are right along in unison with what's going on in the melody. So it's a great example there of what you can do to build a song.
Yeah, and I know that we're basically sitting here saying you could do so many things and there's so many options, and that is true. Don't be overwhelmed. When in doubt, keep it simpler. And I am a hypocrite saying that because I'm the first guilty party of doing way too much. But the more you play, the more you find yourself in band settings and processing other musicians around you, the more your sense for what works will develop. And then even more time will pass, and all of a sudden you not only understand what works and what doesn't, but you have your own flair and your own style that you're bringing to the band every time.
So as a worship leader, sometimes I will ask the keys player, piano player, I would like you to create some energy here in this moment. Other times, I'll say, I want to create an atmosphere. Now, I know I've heard you talk about those being two different things. Can you dig into that and maybe give us some examples of what that might be?
Sure. First of all, I just want to say it is just a great time to be a keys player. We have so many toys that people even 10 years ago didn't have to just make the sounds of our dreams. We already talked about pads. When I'm playing normally, I use drones. So I run everything out of Ableton. If you don't have Ableton, that's fine. You can do and accomplish these things however you want. Your keyboard can probably do it all itself. This is just the way I do things. But let's start with atmosphere. I think atmosphere and energy is kind of a Venn diagram. There are things you do for just atmosphere, for just energy, and some for both. So let's start with pads. Let's talk atmosphere. So I create a drone, and this will just go on forever until I tell it to stop. To create dynamics on the pad, I have a few different things on my MIDI controller that I can control it with, the primary of which is a low-pass filter.
Low-pass filter, okay.
Right. So what a low-pass filter does is it takes all the high, kind of tinny, hissy sounds out of the pad, and I can control the cutoff point of that pad with this knob, just like this. So you hear it kind of opening up and getting brighter, and then I turn the knob back, it gets darker again. So for atmosphere, if we're on a down, quiet verse of a song, we'll keep it down here. And as we approach the chorus, if it's a high-energy song or a powerful song, I'll open this pad up. You might not even notice it's happening as a listener, but you will feel more energy get pumped into the song because this pad now has more high-end and brightness and coming into it. There are, when you're talking about atmospheric sounds in other areas, you want to think about kind of same as a pad is sitting back, having lots of reverb, long release times, and this is just one of a bajillion examples, but this is a new sound I've been using lately to kind of create some atmosphere in songs. It's a kind of a pluck sound with a really long release and really long tail. and you just play it very sparingly. So if you don't have that sound available, just think in terms of low pass filters, long release times, lots of reverb. Those are kind of some of the very pillars of atmosphere, I guess.
Yeah, that's good.
So when we talk energy, we're thinking more high end sometimes, louder, as simple as that sounds. One of the sounds that I go to a lot for really big songs, when we get into a chorus and it's really powerful and the band's all in and you want maximum energy, is a very classic sound called a super saw, with not a low pass but a high pass filter. Because if you allow too much of that mid-range into a sound, you start fighting with instruments too much. So what I have here is a super saw with a high pass filter that sits on top of everything and adds an extra like grit and punch to the sound, and it sounds like this. So if we're playing Another in the Fire, which I did at a service a few nights ago, you can, if you want to get fancy, you got 2 keyboards, use them. You can, there is another in the fire, standing next to me. Will I ever be forgotten? I don't remember the words. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what I'm hearing there is really the high end, maybe the high partials, I've heard it described as that before, is really cutting through, and it's adding this excitement. You can feel it just by the way of the sound.
Right.
The super saw is a certain pad name. Is that correct?
It's a super saw is a generic term for a type of sound made out of detuned saw waves, basically.
Okay. Gotcha.
And that's, again, there's endless ways to accomplish this stuff. The other thing I'll talk about real quick, if I've got time, is tempo-based sounds.
Yeah.
Which add energy like no other. So what I have here are a sound called a pluck, which is another thing. It's got a quick attack. It's kind of like a snap. It's got a quick attack, and then you can hear it ring for a little bit longer. And they're synced up to a tempo. So when I trigger them, it sounds a little bit like this. I'm going to do a key transition here from E to B, which is a perfect fifth. And you'll hear the pad fade nicely into B. And now I'm going to trigger a pluck in B, and it'll sound like this. So you hear that click, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so we've got some movement going on there. And if you really get crazy, if you're in Ableton, you can create some dynamics to your sound by adding filters or modulating the release times of the pluck. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you can see here I've got this knob dedicated to my pluck. So when the knob's all the way down, the pluck is dark and quick. When I open that knob back up,
Travis is one of the best that I know in creating energy like that, and dealing with all these sounds. You obviously may not have all of these things at your fingertips yet, but it might be something that's coming in the future. And there are lots of YouTube videos and ways that you can dive in and learn the specifics of what he's doing there. But the overall arching idea is that atmosphere and energy, and figuring out where you lay in that, even with the equipment you have. Some of you may not even have a Nord keyboard, but there's something on your keyboard that would give you, an ability, a setting to add a little bit of atmosphere, a little bit of just calmness or, glue to the setting. And then there's probably something that has a little bit more, maybe that higher frequency that would add a little bit more energy and just passion to the moment.
Yeah. So whatever keyboard you have, I cannot encourage you enough to not be afraid of whatever settings and knobs and buttons are on it, and just dig in, learn your keyboard at a very fundamental level so you can start creating your own presets and piano sounds and pads, especially pads are almost as important as a piano in contemporary worship. And so, right, like Josh said, you might not have Ableton or a laptop or an interface and all that fancy stuff at your fingertips, but that should not stop you, nor can it stop you from creating really cool, ambient, exciting, whatever you may need type of sounds.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope that you were able to pick up some techniques and maybe some ideas of how a worship leader can communicate to a keys and piano player. And maybe if you're the keys or piano player, you picked up some ideas on what you could do to better your craft in the days ahead. But we're praying for you and hope that you continue to grow in what the Lord is doing in your heart. We are excited to see where He's going to take you.